October 21st, 1868. It is 7:53 in the morning at the corner of Clay and Montgomery in San Francisco, and inside the mining press office, a man named William Strong feels the floor begin to move. He does the sensible thing. He runs for the street. Outside, the firewall of the building beside him, the California Wine Works, is already coming down. It buries Strong and a 40-year-old Chinese man named King Young, and it kills them both. Every person who stays inside that office walks away unhurt. Across the bay, 20 miles of ground is tearing open along a fault that will take the name of the town it destroys. Hayward, population 500. Almost nothing left standing. That is the last time this fault breaks. 158 years ago, in that century and a half, 24,000 people in Alameda County become 2.4 million, and they build directly on top of it. Houses, freeways, water mains, gas lines, a football stadium. And in 2026, a Department of Energy team runs 50 simulated magnitude 7 earthquakes on that fault and finds that the ground motion models the region's building codes were written from do not account for how hard the shaking actually concentrates. This is the terrifying truth about the fault beneath San Francisco. Everyone knows it is coming. Almost nobody has checked the number they built against. To understand what is coming, you have to go back. Not to a disaster, but to a decision. A century and a half of decisions, actually, made by people who were not being reckless. They were building a city. The Hayward Fault runs 74 miles through the East Bay of the San Francisco Bay Area. It comes ashore out of San Pablo Bay in the north and runs south along the base of the East Bay Hills, through Richmond, through Berkeley, through Oakland, through San Leandro, through the city of Hayward that gave it its name, through Union City, and down into Fremont. It is a strand of the same system as the San Andreas, and for most of its length you would never know it was there. It is not a canyon, it is not a scar. In most places, it is a slight change in the slope of a street, and so people built on it, not near it, on it. Hundreds of homes sit directly over the trace. Freeways cross it, rail lines cross it. The pipes that carry the region's drinking water cross it, and so do the gas transmission mains and the high voltage lines that keep several million people supplied with everything they need to live where they live. The United States Geological Survey has a specific phrase for what this adds up to. They call the Hayward the single most urbanized earthquake fault in the United States. Not one of the most dangerous, the most urbanized. There's no other fault in the country with this many people standing directly on top of it. In 1868, when the Hayward Fault last broke, Alameda County held roughly 24,000 residents. Today it holds more than 2.4 million. The population sitting in the zone of greatest risk has grown by a factor of about 100. The fault has not changed at all. The morning of October 21st, 1868 dawned clear and cool, 59 degrees in downtown San Francisco, with fog lying in patches across the lower ground. At 7:53, the Hayward Fault let go. The shaking lasted more than 40 seconds. That number is worth sitting with because 40 seconds is a very long time to be inside a building that is coming apart. Witness after witness described the same thing, in almost the same words, the ground moving in waves like the ocean. The fault broke at the surface for 20 miles, from Warm Springs in what is now Fremont North to San Leandro, and survey data suggests the rupture continued underground as far as Berkeley. The two sides of the fault slid past each other by about 6 feet. Cracks opened in the ground from 6 inches to 2 feet wide. Water spurted out of the fissures. Creeks that had been dry began to run. Near Milpitas, artesian water flowed out of the ground for 48 hours after the shock. The strongest shaking covered roughly 1,000 square miles. In the town of Hayward, population about 500, almost every building was wrecked or badly damaged. A warehouse stacked with hundreds of sacks of wheat collapsed, the roof settling down onto the grain. The flour mill was pushed over onto its side at a 45-degree angle, and the roof slid off, opening the second floor to the sky. Barely a chimney in town was left standing. In San Leandro, population 426, the Alameda County Courthouse came down. The second floor collapsed into the first. The building was a total loss, and as a direct result of that morning, the county seat was moved permanently to Oakland, where it remains to this day. The shaking was felt as far away as Nevada. 36 aftershocks were recorded within 12 hours. In some outlying towns, people counted 150 shocks over the following days and slept in tents for weeks rather than go back inside. Until 1906 came along and took the name from it. This was the Great San Francisco Earthquake. About 30 people were killed. In a region this thinly settled, that number is not the measure of the event. The measure is where and how they died, because those details are still relevant 158 years later. J.W. Jocelyn was a deputy county clerk in San Leandro. He came in early that morning, before the courthouse offices had opened, which is why he was one of the few people in the building. When the shaking started, He did what almost anyone would do. He moved toward the door. He stepped through the front entrance of the courthouse, and the stone cornice above the doorway came down on him and killed him. 4 other people who had been waiting inside the clerk's office stayed put through the shaking, then climbed out through a window over the debris afterward. All 4 of them lived. Across the bay in San Francisco, on ground that had been reclaimed from the old Yerba Buena Cove, the same story played out with different names. The firewall of a building called the California Wine Works collapsed into the street at the corner of Clay and Montgomery. It buried 2 men. One was King Young, a 40-year-old Chinese man. The other was William Strong, and William Strong had been inside the mining press office when the shaking began. He ran into the street to get clear of the building. Everyone who stayed inside that office was unhurt. There is a 3rd story from that morning, and it is a small one. Under Sheriff Borain was in his quarters beside the San Leandro jail when the courthouse came apart. He was hit in the head by falling debris, and he got out, but he left the jail keys behind him. There were 5 prisoners locked inside a damaged building. An attempt to pull them out through a window failed. They were freed only after somebody broke the door down. Nobody in any of these accounts did anything foolish. They ran from a collapsing building, which is the most human thing a person can do. It is also, in an earthquake, very often the thing that kills them. There is a specific reason scientists talk about the Hayward the way they do, and it is not intuition. It is a hole in the ground. Over decades, USGS geologists have cut trenches across the southern section of the fault and read the layers exposed in the walls. Each time the fault has ruptured, it has left a signature in the soil, offset layers, filled cracks, buried surfaces, and those layers can be dated. The trenches have produced evidence for 12 earthquakes over the past 1900 years, every one of them estimated at magnitude 6.3 or greater. The last 6 are dated 1134, 1317, 1475, 1629, 1725, and 1868. Run the arithmetic on those gaps, and you get intervals ranging from 95 years at the short end to 183 years at the long end, averaging about 150. It has now been 158 years since the last one. This is where almost every telling of this story goes wrong, so it is worth being precise. That does not mean the fault is late. A fault is not a train. The average interval between past ruptures is a description of what has already happened, not a schedule for what happens next. 158 years sits past the average and inside the observed range. And the honest statement is simply that the Hayward has entered the window in which its own history says it belongs. What the survey does say, without hedging, is that the fault has reached the point where a powerful and damaging earthquake can be expected at any time. Their published probabilities put the chance of a magnitude 6.7 or larger event on the Hayward at 14.3% by 2034 and 33% before 2043, 1 in 3 inside about 17 years, on the fault with the most people standing on it. Here is the part that makes the Hayward feel safe, and it is the most quietly misleading thing about it. The Hayward Fault creeps. It is not fully locked. It slides slowly and continuously, at a rate commonly measured at somewhere between 4 and 5 millimeters a year, roughly the growth rate of a fingernail. You can go and look at it. It is one of the few faults on Earth where the movement is visible in ordinary infrastructure, and residents of the East Bay walk past the evidence constantly without registering it. Curbs at the base of the Berkeley Hills have been pulled out of line. Stream beds have been offset. The fault passes directly beneath California Memorial Stadium at the University of California, where the accumulated creep has put a visible jog in the concrete. The stadium was rebuilt and retrofitted specifically so that it could flex as the ground beneath it pulls apart. In downtown Hayward, the fault runs under the City Hall built in the 1930s, and the building was eventually given up as a lost cause because the ground under it would not stop moving. It is tempting to read all of this as good news. A fault that is releasing energy continuously ought to be a fault that is diffusing itself. It is not. Creep relieves some of the stress accumulating on the fault. It does not relieve all of it. Below the top, few kilometers, the fault is still locked, still loading, still storing strain that has nowhere to go except into a rupture. The daily movement people can see is a partial payment on a debt that is still growing faster than the payments. The most reassuring thing about the Hayward Fault is a discount, not a cancellation. On October 17, 1989, a magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck on a fault roughly 60 miles south of Oakland. Most of the country watched it happen on live television because a World Series game was about to start. In West Oakland, the Cypress Street Viaduct, a double-deck stretch of Interstate 880, pancaked. The upper deck came down onto the lower one along more than a mile of roadway. 42 people were killed there. A 500-ton concrete crossbeam landed on the front of a red Ford. Petra Berumen, 27 years old, was killed instantly at the wheel. Her 6-year-old son, Julio, had been thrown forward out of the back seat. His left leg was pinned beneath the driver's seat, and his right leg was crushed under the passenger seat. His 9-year-old sister, Kathy, who had been sitting beside him, was pulled free. Julio could not be pulled free. So a pediatric surgeon named James Betts climbed a fire truck ladder, worked his way into the crawl space beneath a collapsed freeway that was still being shaken by aftershocks, reached into the flattened car, and amputated a 6-year-old's leg in order to get him out. Both children survived. In interviews years afterward, Julio was doing well on prosthetics and running his own business, and Kathy was raising 3 children of her own. 4 days after the earthquake, rescuers pulled a longshoreman named Buck Helm out of the same structure. He had been pinned in his car for 80 hours, and he was conscious when they reached him. The entire region celebrated. He died of his injuries about a month later. That was the Bay Area's modern reference point for a major earthquake, and it needs to be understood correctly. Loma Prieta's epicenter was 60 miles away from Oakland. The Hayward Fault runs underneath it. When the survey compared the shaking maps for 1868 against 1989, they found that a repeat of the older earthquake would produce far heavier shaking across the East Bay than 1989 did. The freeway that fell in Oakland was not the worst case. It was the distant one. For most of the modern era, estimating how hard the ground will shake in a future earthquake has been an exercise in statistics. Scientists collect recordings from earthquakes that have already happened, fit curves through the data, and use those curves to predict what a future event of a given size at a given distance will do. These are called empirical ground motion prediction models, and everything downstream depends on them. The problem with statistics is that they describe averages, and an earthquake is not an average. It matters enormously where the rupture starts, how fast it travels, and which direction it runs. So in 2026, a team from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory stopped fitting curves and started building the earthquake from physics instead. Under a Department of Energy project, they assembled a simulation platform with 2 halves, one that models the generation of seismic waves as the fault tears, and one that models those waves propagating through the actual 3-dimensional structure of the Earth beneath the Bay Area. Then they ran it 50 times. Using the Department of Energy's exascale computing infrastructure, the team simulated 50 separate magnitude 7 earthquakes on the Hayward Fault, changing the variables between runs. As the Livermore seismologist Arben Pitarka, who led the study, explained it, since nobody knows exactly how the rupture will evolve, the overall fault slip, where the earthquake starts, how fast it runs, you have to vary those parameters across a large number of simulations in order to reduce the uncertainty in the ground motion estimates. The stated purpose was not academic. In Pitarka's words, the point was to learn what the ground motion for a typical magnitude 7 earthquake in the Bay Area could be, so that they could work with engineers to make sure the buildings and infrastructure could withstand it, and so they could begin preparing to retrofit the vulnerable structures. The results were published in Seismological Research Letters in April of 2026, and they did not say what the region would have preferred. The simulations found a shape, not a random scatter of hard-hit neighborhoods, but a cone, a wedge that begins at the point where the rupture starts and spreads outward along both sides of the fault. Inside that cone, the ground does not simply shake harder. It shakes differently, and the motion arrives as a pulse, a single violent shove rather than a long rattle, and a pulse is the specific kind of loading that tall and flexible buildings handle worst. Engineers call the mechanism rupture directivity, and it works something like a wave being pushed ahead of a boat. As the tear races along the fault, it stacks its own energy up in front of itself. Then came the sentence that turns this from a research finding into a public problem. In describing the effect, the laboratory stated plainly that empirical ground motion prediction models are not well constrained to account for it. Follow that through. Those empirical models are the foundation of regional seismic hazard estimates. Seismic hazard estimates are the foundation of building codes, of retrofit requirements, of the design standards used for bridges, hospitals, water systems, and high-rise towers. Every structure in the East Bay that was engineered to withstand a certain level of shaking was engineered against a number that came, ultimately, out of those models. If the number is low in specific places, then buildings that are fully code compliant, buildings that passed every inspection, buildings whose owners did everything right, could face forces they were never designed to take. Reporting on the study put a figure on it, shaking in some areas near the fault running up to 50% stronger than earlier models anticipated, with the fractured sedimentary rock under the eastern hill communities amplifying motion compared with the firmer bedrock on the western side. The simulations also flagged a second permanent vulnerability, sedimentary basins and smaller microbasins, bowl-shaped depressions in the shallow crust, which amplify ground motion no matter where along the fault the earthquake begins. The Bay Area did not just build on a fault. It may have built against the wrong number. There is already a detailed answer to the question of what a magnitude 7 on the Hayward does, and it did not come from a novelist. It came from the survey and dozens of partner institutions, and it is called Hayward. Hayward is a scenario, not a forecast. It models a hypothetical magnitude 7.0 main shock on the Hayward Fault and its aftershock sequence, and it exists so that hospitals, utilities, and city governments can rehearse against something specific. Its projections are these: 800 people killed, 18,000 injured, roughly $82 billion in property and direct business losses. Then the second disaster, the one that follows the shaking. About 450 large fires burning through residential and commercial floor space, equivalent to more than 52,000 single-family homes, with fire losses alone approaching $30 billion. Fires start after earthquakes because gas lines break and electrical systems short, and they spread because the water mains that fight them have broken in the same instant, which leads to the number that reframes the whole event. In the Hayward scenario, the average East Bay resident loses water service for 6 weeks. Some lose it for as long as 6 months. More than 22,000 people need to be extricated from stalled elevators. More than 2,400 need to be rescued from collapsed buildings. And more than 400,000 people, around 150,000 households, are displaced from their homes, not necessarily because those homes fell down, but because the systems that make a home habitable are gone for a season. That is the shape of it. Not one terrible afternoon, but one terrible minute followed by a very long, very difficult year. At 8:30 on the morning of Thursday, August 13th, 2026, a magnitude 3.8 earthquake struck 2.5 miles north of San Leandro, about 5 kilometers down, on the Hayward Fault. The first automatic estimate called it a 4.1, then a 3.9, and the reviewed magnitude settled at 3.8. 2 aftershocks followed 37 minutes later. It was felt across the East Bay. Nothing was damaged. It should be said clearly, because this is where documentaries like this one usually overreach, that earthquake was not a precursor. Small earthquakes happen on the Hayward routinely, and the overwhelming majority of them are followed by nothing at all. Nobody can predict an earthquake. Not the date, not the place, not the size, not in combination, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What Thursday was a reminder delivered at commute time to several million people about the ground they were standing on. The region has been here before, and its record is mixed in a specific way. After 1868, Bay Area engineers did remarkable work. Iron tie rods binding walls to floors, iron framing inside masonry, and from 1885, the steel frame. Those innovations carried the city's buildings through 1906. But 2 other lessons from 1868 were discussed at the time and then quietly dropped: the danger of building on filled ground, and the plain instruction to build no more cornices. Both were forgotten within a generation. The structural lesson was learned. The lesson about where to build and what to hang over a doorway was not. That is what makes the 2026 work matter. The correction is available now, in advance, while it is still just a number in a model. Pitarka's team did not run those 50 simulations to explain the disaster afterward. They ran them so engineers could find the vulnerable structures first. The Hayward Fault has broken 12 times in 1,900 years. It will break again. The only open question is whether the buildings above it were measured against the right number, and that question still has time to be answered. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Documentaries like this one take a lot of research and a lot of work to put together, and if you got something out of it, a like, a comment, or a subscribe genuinely helps more than you would think. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.